Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. On today's show, the Oyo State Governor, Makinde, has been in London this week in an attempt to woo foreign investors across key sectors, including agribusiness, solid minerals and mining. Channel's Business Global was at the Oyo State Investment Summit, and I, of course, spent some time with His Excellency. I'll be sharing that exclusive interview with you later on in the show. And the government of Bayelsa State has told members of the House of Lords in London that it requires $12 billion to clean up millions of barrels of crude oil that have been spilled into the environment as a result of crude oil exploration activities across the state. Dr. Catherine Nwajiaku-Dao, the chair of the Commission Expert Working Group lobbying on behalf of Bayelsa, will shortly be joining me from here in the British capital with a detailed assessment on their latest findings. Then later, in just a few weeks' time, the 25th edition of the Africa Energy Forum will be taking place in Nairobi, Kenya, bringing together decision makers in the African energy market in a bid to move the industry forward. George Hudson, the portfolio manager and director of corporate development Africa at EnergyNet, will be joining me shortly to share details on what we should expect. But first, let's start the show with news coming out of Asia this week. On the sidelines of the G7 summit, leading Japanese businesses have committed to investing almost £18 billion in businesses and projects across the United Kingdom, generating growth in key sectors, creating high-skilled jobs and driving technology innovation. Japan is currently Britain's fifth largest investor, with trading goods and services totalling £27.7 billion last year. In other British business news, Stellantis, which is the parent company of vehicles such as Vauxhall and Peugeot, have this week warned the Prime Minister that it could be forced to close its British factories, with a loss of 2,000 manufacturing jobs, unless the Conservative government renegotiates incoming post-Brexit trading rules on sourcing batteries for electric vehicles. According to Brexit trading arrangements from next year, 45% of an electric car's value should originate in the UK or EU to qualify for trade without tariffs. Vauxhall bosses said the rising cost of raw materials and the ongoing energy crisis meant it was unable to meet these rules of origin. Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined in the studio by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak under pressure from multiple sides, but this week it's Brexit that's reared its ugly head again. Not only are we hearing from staunch Brexit supporters that Brexit's not working, we've also had a pretty serious warning from Stellantis, the parent company of cars like Vauxhall and Peugeot, saying they're basically going to have to leave Britain if it doesn't renegotiate its trade deal with the EU. What's gone on there?
Yeah, so he's had some relief fairly recently, actually. He's in Japan at the moment, trying to sort out some trade deals, which the UK desperately needs. And he's just announced that businesses in Japan have committed to investing nearly £18 billion in the economy. That is a very small drop in the economy, but it's still news that we need at this time. He said the pledges are a massive vote of confidence in the British economy, but a reminder that the UK has only signed 3 trade deals since we left the EU and since Brexit happened. That's with Australia and with New Zealand, and a digital trade deal with Singapore. And I think we were expecting a lot more. We were hearing about this oven-ready deal, and that the US was ready to jump on board. We are so far away from getting a trade deal with the US. I mean, negotiations started a long time ago and haven't really gone anywhere. It looks like Joe Biden's really unimpressed with the whole thing. So I think those are the difficulties he's seeing there. He's trying to obviously play up these announcements and saying that the reason we left the EU was to do precisely this, was to be able to go around the world outside the EU and be able to make our own trade deals with the countries that we want to work with. But Mr. Sunak has ordered talks, like you said, with the EU to try and sort of work around what is happening at the moment, which is, like you say, a lot of car makers, not just this one, have come out and said we can't work with this. We can't continue to produce in the UK if this is what's happening. So Stellantis, like you said, they own Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën and Fiat. Those are huge names here in the UK. One of the world's biggest car makers, of course, and then Ford also saying that these rules are pointless that are coming in, the new trade rules, and Jaguar Land Rover said the timing of the new rules is unrealistic. So basically the whole industry, the automobile industry here, is all coming together and saying this is not going to work. So that's a big problem for Rishi Sunak. He signed signed off on this trade deal. It's all done and dusted. This is what's happening. And now he's going to have to go back to the EU with a cap in hand to be able to say, hey, can we change a few things because we're going to lose a shed load of jobs. So there's going to be thousands, tens of thousands of jobs if these companies do pull themselves out of the UK. And then, like you say, another headache is Nigel Farage, the founder, the archangel of Brexit. He is the UKIP guy. So he's not conservative, and he's pretty anti-conservative, but he's even more far right for people who don't know who Nigel Farage is. And he was really the poster boy of Leave. That's what his whole career has been about, is to get it out of Europe. He's come out now and said that Brexit is not actually benefiting the economy, and he's blamed this on useless Tory politicians, saying they should have gone further, saying they should have done things differently. So Rishi Sunak here is in the middle of so much, and you've got a lot of the country as well have just voted for other politicians in the local elections, partly based on how badly Brexit's going.
Yes.
And they're coming from the other side. They're saying we should be back in Europe. So it's a really hard time for Rishi Sunak, not that it's ever been an easy time. But yeah, he's doing his best. He's trying to do little, show that the UK can compete, that we can do trade deals with places like Japan, and but it's such a hard place to be in right now, because there's going to be an election coming up. I think a lot of that election is going to be fought on basically, the economy. Migration
as well.
The migration, exactly.
Which is Brexit too.
Which is exactly that's what Nigel Farage is saying. That's partly what he's saying about how Brexit hasn't worked economically, because it hasn't cut migration. And that was one of the main things people voted for Brexit, was to manage people coming into the country. And they haven't managed to do that for so many other reasons. So it's a really difficult position for him to be in. And I think it's actually quite worrying for the UK economy, of course, which is stagnant. It's increased by just 0.1% between January and March. It's the lowest growth economy in the G7, so something needs to change for Rishi Sunak's fortunes to change. And I think that car thing is really worrying, because that's a lot of jobs in the UK. If the automobile industry starts to move overseas, that's really, really worrying for people, because a lot of people are employed in that industry.
Absolutely. We're just limping along at the moment, aren't we, Simon? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The Oyo State Governor, Makinde, has delivered a keynote address at the Oil International Business Summit, which took place in London today, as part of his administration's move toward a global investment drive aimed at attracting more investors in the diaspora to invest in the state. Under the theme Accessing the Pioneer Advantage to Sustainable Investments in Oyo State, the summit brought together key actors in the agribusiness, solid minerals and mining, tourism, sustainable energy and infrastructure sectors. Before the gathering, I sat down with His Excellency for an exclusive interview.
We've been analysing and checking out where the global flow of investments, where are they actually coming from? But we've seen a big shift. Before now, European investors, they don't actually want to come to Africa, and Nigeria in particular, because we have issues with our documentation, we have issues with, being open. We have also issues with rule of law. Our institutions, they are quite weak. But the good thing is we've seen a lot of diasporans, a lot of Nigerians, all over the world that they are being celebrated, here and there. And these folks, even though we have a country that has not allowed them to actually hit their potential, but the world has come to recognize Nigerians, be it in the medical field, financial field, as really very smart people. So I felt we should leverage on that opportunity, right now, and utilize some of the good things happening, around the world to Nigerians, to bring attention, back to us. And for us in Oyo State, this past 4 years, we've been able to achieve quite a bit, but our story has not gotten out into the world the way, we would have loved it to. So my job is bring the story out, and also let investors know the opportunities that exist. And, if you take energy transition, for instance, this is something that is real, that is happening around the world. The big economies in Nigeria, from the subnational level, majorly the oil and gas states. But now, with energy transition, we want to have that first-mover advantage to say, look, Oyo State is in the forefront of this energy transition, and we have the land, we have the structure to actually be number one champion of energy transition in Nigeria. And that's one of the things that I plan to sell at this summit. 4 years ago was my own first public service job, so to say. I came from the private sector. All my life I've dealt within the private sector. So we can see a lot of excitement. The business of government shouldn't be to run businesses. It should be to create the enabling environment, for businesses to thrive. And I believe if you see what has happened in Lagos over these years, in terms of the foundation he laid, the continuity that you've seen, you can see a little bit of a different Lagos, so to say. I also look forward to collaborating with the president-elect, as the president of Nigeria post May 29. And I believe that it will be a little bit different, and change is something that is exciting, and I know our people are looking forward to few changes to be made, and I think he has the capacity and enough good people around that can really help him achieve that. I mentioned to some people that, look, you do have issues in Nigeria with human resources, exposure, energy level, and things like that. But he's been through that before, and I know he can really assemble the team that can take Nigeria, that can move Nigeria forward. We've been able to provide, a solid infrastructure. If you look at the agribusiness sector, we've awarded contracts, for agri estates across different agricultural belts in Oyo State, Akufo, Irua, and Fashola. And Fashola is at about 80% completion, fully subscribed. So agro-processing, we also have the dry port coming up at Monia. You have the rail link, standard gauge now from Lagos to Ibadan at Monia. Exactly. So I'm excited about letting the people know and letting the people know the opportunities that exist in Oyo State, and also letting them know that this administration will continue to work really hard to ensure that people's investment are protected, rule of law, and ease of doing business,
The government of Bayelsa State has said it requires 12 billion US dollars to clean up millions of barrels of crude oil that have been spilled into the environment as a result of crude oil exploration activities across the state. The announcement was made during a gathering at the House of Lords in London on Tuesday. For a detailed assessment on the new report, I'm now being joined by one of its authors, Dr. Catherine Nwajiaku Dao, the chair of the Bayelsa State Commission Expert Working Group. Dr. Catherine Nwajiaku Dao, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I know you've had a very busy week. You were in the House of Lords earlier. Bayelsa State, as many of our viewers will know, has been locked into a pretty fierce battle with Shell and Eni for decades. But this week, you've published a new report assessing the scale of the devastation. Talk to us about your findings.
Thank you very much. Yes, the findings are quite alarming. We noted a systemic crisis of pollution in the state, and the work we did showed pollution on a number of grounds. So oil spill pollution, which is not the result of one particular accident, but an everyday occurrence, so that the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which is the largest oil catastrophe the world has known, we count that every year for the last 50 years, oil has been spilt in Bayelsa at the level of the Exxon Valdez spill. That's every day, every year for the last 50 years. For every man, woman, and child in Bayelsa, that's approximately 3 million people, we estimate that there's 1.5 barrels per person spilt in the state. That's alarming. And that's just on oil. We also have gas flaring, which is endemic. And we have a problem of the disposal of oil-related waste in conditions that are not of international standards.
Yes, it's absolutely awful and terrifying. Of course, we know that there are long-lasting impacts, but for some reason it's just not getting the attention that it deserves, apart from, of course, the work that you've been conducting. There is a call to action, so you weren't just meeting and talking. Your report recommends sweeping legal reforms to the oil and gas industry and regulations from the US, UK, Europe and Nigeria. Can you talk to us about this? And I would like to know what your opinion is of the position of the Nigerian government, because, of course, they're allowed to come into the country and keep exploiting, aren't they?
Most definitely. I mean, one of the problems we face, it can be an advantage and a problem, is that the international oil companies are the operating companies, and they work in joint ventures with the Nigerian government. And so we have what some have called an oil slick or a slick alliance between the Nigerian government and the oil companies. But we believe that all parties have responsibility for cleaning up and restoring the land of Bayelsa, the land and waters of Bayelsa. And we're calling for at least an investment of some $12 billion over the next 12 years, as well as legislative and regulatory changes. We know that there has been a Petroleum Industry Act passed a couple of years ago in Nigeria, but we believe it's insufficient to take account of the pollution crisis of the state. We believe that the Ministry of the Environment needs to play a much more robust role in terms of regulating. We also believe that it should not be up to communities who are the victims of oil and gas pollution to prove that companies are liable for negligence. We should have a no-fault liability embedded in our legal frameworks to ensure that the polluter pays principle and compensation as a matter of course is standard.
Yes, of course. Just lastly, and very briefly, if you can, Dr. Catherine, what has been the response from Shell and Eni? Again, our viewers will be familiar with the story, but I know, of course, they've got very expensive lawyers backing them, haven't they?
Yes, they do have very expensive lawyers, and we believe that what is required is a concerted effort We implore the oil companies to step up and take a lead. We have invited them. We invited them during the course of our investigations on a number of occasions. In fact, we were very, very steadfast in trying to do that. We received letters eventually from them that are published in the report, but we would have liked them to come and speak with us and communities to discuss what can be done. They were not able, or they've declined our invitation, several invitations to attend, but we are still open to discussing with them how we can move this forward. We also believe that the governments in which these companies are domiciled, so in Italy and in the UK, have a very important role to play in bringing their companies to take the moral and ethical stance that is required given the scale of the problem. We believe it's possible to get bring the companies to order if our governments also play an important role.
Absolutely. Well, it was an extensive investigation, a very detailed report, a good showing in the House of Lords this week. And of course, we are going to be following this story because it affects so many of us. Dr. Catherine Nwajiaku-Dowell, the chair of the Commission Expert Working Group lobbying on behalf of the Bayelsa State Government. Thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure. It's been my pleasure.
Now to our final story. Next month, the 25th edition of the African Energy Forum takes place in Nairobi, Kenya, which is the first time the gathering is being conducted on the continent. The leading energy event brings together decision makers in the African energy market in a bid to move the industry forward. Well, for more on what we should expect, I'm now being joined by George Hudson, the Portfolio Manager and Director of Corporate Development Africa at EnergyNet. George Hudson, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global today. 25 years is a very long time. Of course, we know the world is a very different place, but the Energy Forum remains. Talk to us about the history of the event.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we as EnergyNet, we organise a global portfolio of investment meetings, which look to facilitate investment into Africa's power sector. So the Africa Energy Forum is our longest running meeting. It's now in its 25th year. And it really has become the global meeting place, if you like, for the key public and private sector stakeholders in the sector. And it really provides a platform for policymakers, investors, industry leaders to discuss and explore the opportunities in the sector.
Absolutely. I've seen a couple of press releases that have hit my mailbox this week. And the who's who of the sector are going to be there. I'm curious to know why Nairobi, not Abuja. Not saying that Abuja would be better. Of course, it would have been. But we did have our own energy summit last month. But why is this forum so important to the sector? Because, George, there are a lot of talk shops, especially when it comes to Africa and energy. Lots of wishes, doesn't really trickle down. Does the conversations that happen at the forum become policy and change the way the industry works?
They really do. And to touch on your first point, we really love coming to Nigeria. We've hosted a number of meetings in Abuja over the years and Lagos. Nairobi is a really important market for us because KenGen, the utility, were the first utilities to support the forum back in 1999. But we are huge fans of Nigeria, and we're going to have a big, strong Nigerian government delegation with us in Nairobi, which is hugely exciting. But I think there are quite a few reasons why the Africa Energy Forum holds importance for Africa's power sector. And you're right, there are a lot of meetings out there, and it's difficult sometimes to distinguish one over the other. But I think firstly, investment promotion is hugely important. Africa Energy Forum brings the entire value chain of a power project together. So you have the project sponsor, the developer, you have the governments there, you have the investors. It really is a place where deals are signed. And there will be hundreds of millions of dollars of business signed in Nairobi. There will be MOUs signed between governments and investors. So it really is an important place for business. And then, as you say, if you have decisions that are made, regulations that are implemented, do those trickle down? Well, actually, AEF will see governments and investors making decisions that will shape the future of the sector. And it's very easy to read about these in articles, watch them in videos, but actually if you can be there in person, hearing these from the people who are making those decisions, that's hugely, hugely effective. So we'll be having market leaders from across the continent laying out the new regulatory frameworks going forward.
Absolutely. Really fascinating hearing from you, George. George Hudson, who is the Portfolio Manager and Director of Corporate Development Africa at EnergyNet. Thank you so much for your time today. See you in Nairobi.
Thank you.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.